Hello, this is video number 2 for the lymphatic system. And in this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about the lymphatic vessels and the flow of lymph through those vessels. So here's the outline, and this is what we covered in the first video, kind of an overview of the lymphatic system in terms of function and structure. And then I started talking about the lymphatic vessels last time, and mostly this was about the capillaries. So here are the 4 main classes of lymphatic vessels, capillaries being the smallest, lymphatic collecting vessels, lymphatic trunks, lymphatic ducts. So these 2 through 4 are the main topic for this video. And each of these get larger and larger. And there are fewer and fewer of these vessels as we progress along this hierarchy, I guess you could say, of the different types of lymphatic vessels. This slide I showed in the last video, and this is just a reminder of lymphatic capillaries. Lymphatic capillaries are intermingled with blood capillaries, and the main function is they're going to take up fluid from the tissue in the interstitial space. And this fluid has exited from the blood capillaries, and it's going to enter into a lymphatic capillary, and this fluid is going to flow away through the hierarchy of vessels. So this slide is showing the different types of vessels, lymphatic capillaries flowing into collecting vessels, into trunks, and then into ducts. And then on the figure are shown not the capillaries, so the capillaries are kind of microscopic, but these would be the 3 other larger types of lymphatic vessels. The collecting vessels are more common, and the collecting vessels, one of the features of them, they have these lymph nodes along their way. So these kind of bumpy structures are the lymph nodes along the pathway of lymphatic collecting vessels. The lymphatic collecting vessels are going to merge into trunks, which are larger vessels. Some of them are shown here. They're not really labeled on this slide. Some of them are shown up here as well. And then the lymphatic trunks are going to merge into one of 2 lymphatic ducts. So there's one here called the right duct, and there's another one here called the thoracic duct. I'll talk more about the anatomy of that later on. So let's start with the collecting vessels. Lymph flowing through the capillaries is going to merge into these larger collecting vessels. And so let's break those down a little bit more. So the collecting vessels are larger than the capillaries. They form by merging of the capillaries. And the collecting vessels are similar in structure to blood veins in that they have 3 layers or tunics in the wall of the vessel. There are 2 characteristic features of lymphatic collecting vessels. One is thin walls and frequent internal valves. The internal valves act to prevent backflow of lymph. And so lymph is going to flow from the capillaries through the collecting vessels and then eventually into a lymphatic trunk. And these valves are basically ensuring that there's one-way flow of lymph through those set of vessels. The other characteristic feature is lymphatic collecting vessels have along their way at least 1, maybe 2 lymph nodes, or even more than 2, but at least 1 lymph node along their pathway. So the lymph that is flowing through them is going to filter through these lymph nodes. And the lymph nodes are where you have some of the immune system cells that are performing immune surveillance of the lymph flowing through. Okay? Now the lymphatic collecting vessels are going to merge into the lymphatic trunks. And there are 9 total lymphatic trunks. So these are larger than the lymphatic collecting vessels. And for the 9, they're broken down into 4 left-right pairs and 1 unpaired lymphatic trunk. So the 4 left-right pairs are listed here on the slide. There is a left and right jugular trunk, And this is draining lymph from the head and neck. Okay? Then left and right subclavian trunks. These are draining lymph from the arms, from the breasts, and the superficial thoracic wall. So the outermost kind of shell of the thoracic wall. There are left and right bronchomediastinal trunks. These are draining lymph from deeper thoracic structures, heart, lungs, and other tissues deep to the wall. There are left and right lumbar trunks. These are draining lymph from the legs, from the wall of the abdomen and the pelvis, and from the pelvic organs, reproductive organs, and rectum. And finally, the unpaired lymphatic trunk is the intestinal trunk, and this is draining lymph from most of the organs in the abdomen. Okay? And then the lymphatic trunks are going to merge into one of two ducts, and the ducts are not at all bilaterally symmetrical. The right duct and the thoracic duct. And then the ducts are going to transport lymph back into the bloodstream. They're going to connect to blood vessels, veins, and that's where the lymph eventually gets returned back to the bloodstream. So let's look at the anatomy. If I forgot, this slide has some basic information of where the actual connection is. So for the right lymphatic duct, it's located near the right clavicle, and it's going to receive lymph from 3 lymphatic trunks. So the right jugular, so that's draining lymph from the head and neck. The right subclavian, draining lymph from the arm and the wall of the thorax. And the right bronchomediastinal, draining lymph from the deep thoracic structures. And this dumps lymph into the right subclavian, the juncture point of the right subclavian and right internal jugular veins. Okay, so that's shown on this slide. First of all, just showing the anatomy of the trunks and the ducts. So let's start at the inferiormost here. Here is the intestinal trunk. This is the one that's not paired. And this is going to branch, and those branches are going to, they're going to feed into collecting vessels and eventually into lymphatic capillaries that are in most of the abdominal organs. The lumbar, right lumbar trunk and left lumbar trunk are going to drain from the legs and the pelvic organs. Okay, so lymph is going to flow eventually into these 3, and these are going to merge into a structure. It's kind of a chamber where all of those kind of merge in together. That's called the cisterna chyli. Okay, and then from that, this is where the thoracic duct forms. Thoracic duct is going to run up alongside basically the back body wall, and the thoracic duct is going to connect eventually into the other trunks, jugular trunk, bronchomediastinal trunk, and subclavian trunks on the left side. Right, here's the situation for the right lymphatic duct. Right lymphatic duct is a very short vessel, and it forms by the merging of the right subclavian trunk, right jugular trunk, and right bronchomediastinal trunk. Those 3. Okay? The right lymphatic duct now is connecting into the juncture between the right subclavian vein and the right jugular vein. So all of the lymph that's been collected through all of these vessels, through all of these vessels now is going to be returned into the bloodstream. The lymph that's flowing through the thoracic duct and connecting with the left jugular, subclavian, bronchomediastinal is going to be dumped into the juncture between the left jugular and the left subclavian vein. And that's where lymph now is going to be rejoined into the bloodstream from those structures. Okay, so that's kind of a quirk of the lymphatic trunks and ducts. The trunks, for the most part, are left-right symmetrical, with the exception of the intestinal trunk only being one of those. The lymphatic ducts are not at all left-right symmetrical. So because of that difference for the ducts, this slide is illustrating where, what parts of the body are drained by the right lymphatic duct, dark green, versus the the thoracic duct, the kind of olive green structure here. Okay, so from the thorax up, there is right-left symmetry. Right duct is draining from the right side of the thorax, head and neck, right arm. The thoracic duct is draining from the left side of the head and neck, thorax, and left arm. But everything inferior to the diaphragm, basically, is going to be drained into the thoracic duct. Okay. All right, just a couple of slides to talk about how lymph moves. Because there is no equivalent of a heart generating pressure to push lymph forward from capillaries to collecting vessels to trunks and then into ducts. How does it move? And basically how it moves is very similar to how blood moves in the low pressure venous system. Basically, anything that squeezes a vein, that compresses a vein, because it has internal valves, is going to push blood forward from one station to the next station. Similarly, that's what's driving forward movement of lymph. If there are any nearby muscles to a lymphatic vessel, contraction of that skeletal muscle is going to help to push lymph forward. Also the respiratory pump. If you remember when we talked about blood vessels, the respiratory pump, the changing pressures in the abdomen and thorax. When you inhale and exhale, you depress your diaphragm or you allow it to relax and form kind of a dome shape. That's going to generate the respiratory pump. That's also pushing lymph forward through the lymphatic vessels. A couple of other things that can be come into play in the lymphatic system is any kind of pulsatile blood vessel, artery nearby. Just the pulsatile action of that is going to help to compress lymphatic vessels. And there is also somewhat a sort of a peristaltic like contraction of smooth muscle in the walls of the larger lymphatic vessels, which is also going to sort of give a somewhat low-level pumping action to it. Now, what can go wrong in the lymphatic system is when you don't have these things functioning to move lymph forward for a variety of reasons. And that causes something like this, which is a pooling of the fluid. It's not being returned through all of these vessels, capillaries, lymphatic collecting vessels, lymphatic trunks, and it causes what's called lymphedema. Edema is swelling of the tissue due to pooling of the fluid, and if it's due to a blockage in a lymphatic vessel, then it's called lymphedema. Oftentimes this is seen in the limbs, but it can occur in the body trunk as well, or in the head and neck region as well. Usually what happens is there's some kind of blockage or obstruction in a vessel, and that plug prevents forward flow of lymph and therefore results in pooling of the fluid in the tissue. How can this come about? Well, some of the causes are listed here on the slide. If you have some kind of traumatic injury which damages a vessel, basically collapses it or severs it, then that's going to result in a lack of flow of lymph out of that tissue. There can be blockages due to surgery as well. Surgeons usually try to avoid severing a lymphatic vessel, but sometimes, for example, in cancer surgery, removal of a tissue requires removal of lymph nodes or vessels, and then that can result in a blockage. There also can be infections that can cause a blockage, and one example of that is some types of parasitic worms can occupy the lymphatic vessels, and just because of that, cause blockage. Lymphedema can be treated by any kind of external pressure, depending on the cause, any kind of external pressure that's going to help to force fluid forward out of let's say a limb. Elevating the limb, for example, if it's a leg, right, helping gravity to move fluid as well. Massaging the tissue to help move fluid out of it. Movement and exercise can help because that's causing contraction of skeletal muscle, which can compress lymphatic vessels. So any of that will help movement of lymph through the system and reduce the swelling in the tissue. Well, I'm going to end this video here, and in the next video we'll get into the other main function of the lymphatic system, and that is immune surveillance and immune defense through occupation of the lymphatic organs and tissues with immune system cells. See ya.